Now, the overview of Nehemiah's chapters 9 through 12. First of all, in chapter 9, the people confess in prayer that they haven't kept the law. Nehemiah chapter 9 is actually an amazing chapter for more than one reason. I'll kind of give more of a drier reason why it's such an amazing chapter in the Bible. It's an amazing chapter in the Bible because it's one of these rare places that doesn't happen very often where you basically get a reciting of what? The history of the children of Israel. You don't get that very often. It happens, of course, as it in what you would say in real time in Exodus and Numbers and Joshua. Then you get some accounts of it occurring in the Psalms. Psalm 104, I believe, is a long account of Israel's history. Nehemiah chapter 9 is a long account of Israel's history. If I hadn't have told you those two previous places, where would be the most likely place you would remember a long recounting of Israel's history? Acts chapter 7, where Stephen does the recounting of the children of Israel. So this one is pretty good, pretty complete. I actually, it just now occurs to me, I've never done a comparison between the one in Psalms and this one as to which one's more extensive. But this one actually mentions a lot. And the whole premise is God has done all of these things for us. And we have what? And we failed Him. You know, if you notice, we're not going to read all of it, but starting in verse 1, now on the 24th day of this month, the children of Israel were assembled with fasting and sackcloth and with dust on their heads. Now, you look back in chapter 8, and what's the difference in time here? And now they're not. Right. The difference of time, look in verse, let's see, we passed it. In verse, as we look down in verse 15, I believe it is. Yes, and that was the point, and I don't see it just right off the bat. But just a couple of days after this feast was over, we go into chapter 9. So they had this joyful feast because the Feast of Tabernacles or booths, what did it commemorate? Them wandering in the wilderness. That's why you had the tents or the booths, God's protection over them. It was also during the fall of the year. So it was a what? It was a celebration of harvest. It was a joyful occasion. Well, now on the 24th day of the month, the children of Israel assembling and fasting sackcloth, dust on their heads, and those of the Israelite lineage separated themselves from all foreigners, and they stood, and what did they do? Right. They confessed their sins and their iniquities. They stood up in their place. They read from the book of the law of the Lord their God for 1/4 of one day. And another fourth they confessed and they worshiped their God. And this was where Nehemiah is going to enter into prayer. And there's some instances, there's 3 big instances in the Old Testament where you have intercessory prayer. I don't know how it turned out this way, but Daniel 9 is one of them. Nehemiah 9 is another one. And then, where's the last one? Daniel 9, Nehemiah 9. And then another 9th chapter in the Old Testament. Ezra. I believe it was Ezra 9. Daniel 9, Ezra 9, and Nehemiah 9, if I'm not mistaken. Those 3 chapters are long prayers to God for the sins of the people. And that's exactly what starts taking place in Nehemiah chapter 9. And the prayer begins just in the next verse, in that 5th verse. Stand up and bless the Lord your God forever and ever. And that's where it begins, this long reciting. So you get down to the end of the chapter, in chapter 9, and it says, the end of verse 36, and because of all of this, we make a sure covenant and we write it. Our leaders, our Levites, and our priests then seal it. So chapter 9 goes through this confession of sins, and then to connect it to chapter 10, at the end of chapter 9, after they had confessed their sins to God, what did they essentially do? They made a covenant. So we get into chapter 10. These people make this covenant then to keep the law. And what do you think some of the elements of keeping this law would be? As you're looking in chapter 10, it actually takes you a little while to get down to it. It's all the way down in verse 28, because it talks about all of the people involved in the making of the covenant. But you get down into verse 28, and all of these people separated themselves. 29, they joined with their brethren. They entered into a curse and an oath to walk in God's law, which was given by Moses, the servant of God, and to observe and do all of the commandments of the Lord, our Lord, and His ordinances and His statutes. So starting in verse 30, what did they promise to do? Not to give their daughters. So in verse 31, what did they promise to do? Right, they would keep up on the Sabbath. In verse 30, that was 31, verse 32, I think I mistakenly said 32. So what did they do in 32 now? They make a little what? A little obligation that every year you would do what? You would give 1/3 of a shekel for the maintenance, for the upkeep of the temple. This kind of falls into an interesting little spot. It goes back to Exodus 30, I believe it is, 30 or 31, but I think it's 30, where Moses kind of instituted this. It wasn't necessarily an exact command in the law, but it stayed around for a long time. Moses started it, now Nehemiah brings it back up. You can see it in the New Testament. A lot of things, by the way, when we finish this, there was a suggestion for us to maybe talk about the intertestamental period of time for just a handful of class periods, and then maybe do a harmony of the Gospels. Tell me if you would like to do that. But as you go into the Gospels, one of the miracles that Jesus performed with the coin in the fish's mouth, do you know what that was for? That was for this temple tax. So you can see it extending out in time. So this is what they took an oath and they took a covenant to do. In verse 34, they cast lots among the priests, the Levites, the people, for bringing wood offering to the house at the appointed times of the year to burn on the altar. In verse 35, what did they make a covenant to do? To bring the first fruits of their ground. In verse 36, to bring the firstborn of our sons and our cattle. When it was written in the law, the firstborn of our herds and our flocks to the house of our God, to the priests who minister to the house of God, to bring the first fruits of dough and our offerings and fruit. So all of this produce, you can immediately see the produce going to the upkeep of the temple and the upkeep of the priest and the servants and the singers and all that it took to make sure that they could have their worship, essentially. There is something interesting, though, that they brought the first fruits of. Did you catch that? They brought the first fruits of their what? in verse 36 of their sons. Anyone have this goes back to Exodus. Does anyone know what that would mean?
At the very beginning, God required the first fruits to be dedicated to His work, but then the first son, firstborn sons, but then He replaced it with the Levites, I thought.
And then, you had, all the way back when they left Egypt, of course, what happened with the firstborn? The Egyptians lost all of their firstborn, and they lost firstborn everything. Everything that lived, they lost the firstborn of. So we move kind of before that back into Exodus, and God had made these firstborn of their children kind of sacred or special. God wasn't asking for them as a sacrifice like a burnt offering, but He was asking that they did what? That they kind of dedicated them to the Lord. And that brings up, of course, a question: why not dedicate all of your children to the Lord? So why would you dedicate the firstborn of your children to the Lord? In that society, in that time, why would you dedicate your firstborn to the Lord? They would be the ones who were heirs. So we all, we love all of our children. We treat all of our children similarly. That is our culture. They looked at things just a little bit different, especially as it related to property. The firstborn was the one who had the more eminent possessions and eminent promise given to them. So you dedicated them to the Lord because in that one way, they were, in a sense, kind of the most important ones. Well, they kind of make a return back to that. They put back what everything was fresh out of the new covenant of the Lord. Doesn't mean that they were offering them as a sacrifice at all, but they were putting back that element of giving them to God. So 39, the children of Israel, the children of Levi will bring the offering of the grain, of new wine, of oil, for there to be the ministers and the gatekeepers and the singers. So they would not neglect the house of the Lord. They wouldn't forsake it. Then as we keep on going, just some more overviews real quick. In chapter 11, what begins to happen? Right. And they have people who are selected to stay in the city, and then people selected to stay outside of the city. Again, this is a chapter 11 gives a fairly lengthy catalog, I guess you would say, of all of the people and their numbering and where they ended up, whether inside the city or outside the city. So we get down to, well, really into chapter 12. So as we get into chapter 12, you've got these people living inside the city, living outside the city. Now we get to chapter 12. What does chapter 12 bring up? The priests and the Levites, the listing of the priests and the Levites, that goes down through verse 21. Then if you note, during the reign of Darius the Persian, a record was also kept of the Levites and the priests who had been heads of their fathers' houses in the days of, and then it lists a lot of separate people. Again, a long listing, and we reach to verse 27. Everything is kind of put and identified. You've identified the people who've come back. That happened in chapter 7. You've identified the people who belong in the city, the people who are going to be the workers of God. Those have all been identified. They've all been cataloged. You've determined who's going to live in the city versus living outside of the city. You have gotten all of the people to agree to give, to contribute to essentially establishing a system again of their living, essentially there was one thing left to do. And that starts in verse 27 of chapter 12. And what was that one last thing left to do? You had to dedicate the wall. And the way they dedicated the wall, as you read through it, was really kind of special. They put people on top of the wall, two groups of people, and they started in opposite directions. One went north and one went south. Nehemiah went with the northern one. And of course, if it's a wall, you eventually do what? The two groups eventually meet one another. They come together. And they came together at the temple, and of course, at the temple, what do you imagine they did? They offered sacrifices and joyfully kept the law of God. In verse 31, I want you to note this, because the people who had walked the wall, note what they're called. So I brought the leaders of Judah up on the wall, and I appointed two large what? Choirs. The New King James Version calls them thanksgiving choirs. So these people traversed the wall while singing. One went to the right hand of the wall toward the refuse gate, and after them, of course, went Hoshea and half of the leaders of Judah, and again a large catalog of people who went with them. And the other thanksgiving choir in verse 38 then went the opposite way, and I was behind them, and half of the people on the wall going past the Tower of the Ovens as far as the broad wall, and it describes all of the places in the wall where they went. So then in verse 40, the two thanksgiving choirs stood in the house of God. So it seems like they went around the wall, they met, they go into the house of God, half of the rulers with them, again a list of people there. In verse 43, what did they do? Offer great sacrifices and rejoice, for God had made them rejoice with great joy. The women and the children also rejoiced, that the joy of Jerusalem was what? Was heard afar off. Very wonderful. And then chapter 12 just kind of ends by stating what? All of the storerooms were now filled. All of the singers were appointed. Everyone had taken their place, and everything got back to exactly what God wanted. So next week we're going to look at the lessons from this, because there are some important lessons again for us today.